HMS Terror, as were the other Royal Navy monitors from the First World War, was an odd-looking ship with large guns and bare decks. Terror and her sister Erebus came about after the poor performance of the first of the 15-inch monitors, Marshal Ney, as her machinery was rather poor. Terror, a better-designed monitor armed with 15-inch guns, entered service with the Royal Navy in mid-1916, going on to participate in the bombardment of Ostend and Zeebrugge in January 1917. Later that year, Terror was damaged by German torpedo boats, where she was saved thanks to her rather large torpedo bulges. Following the war, she did trial firing against captured German ships, namely SMS Baden, and was a turret drill ship, as well as going east to defend the Empire against a possible Japanese incursion. During the Second World War, she fought across the Mediterranean theater. Due to her First World War vintage, Terror would have refits and upgrades throughout her career. Still, on February 24, 1941, Terror was sunk by German dive bombers 20 miles northwest of Derna, making her the only monitor lost in combat during the Second World War. In this video, I am not going to cover the development of Terror, as she and Erebus are so similar that I don't want to double down on that, because there's plenty to cover in Terror's career. Just know she is a 15-inch monitor, which makes her a very desirable and useful tool for bombardment missions up and down the Belgian and French coast as the Great War developed. To that end, Terror arrived in Dover, where the other monitors were stationed, on August 8, 1916. To take from Ian Buxton in Big Gun Monitors, Design, Construction, and Operations 1914 to 1945, the arrival of Terror at Dover on August 8, 1916, marked the appearance of the first monitor carrying big guns and having a reasonable turn of speed. After steaming across to Dunkirk, she was soon in action on the 16th, firing at a canal bridge near Middelkeuken. Her 3 rounds at maximum elevation were more like a gun trial than a serious attempt to hit the target. Erebus arrived at Dover on September 5th, just in time to join the other monitors supporting Haig's offensive. Erebus and Terror were out for several days. Still, they were not allowed to fire as many rounds as the 12-inch monitors to avoid wearing out their guns prematurely on non-essential targets. Firing on the 12th, 13th, and 15th of September was carried out at anchor from behind a smokescreen, generally using the 12-inch monitors as backgaming marks in conjunction with shore spotting. About 70 rounds of HE was fired between the two ships, with no great attempt at accuracy, as only a general harassment was required. A more careful bombardment was made of Zeebrugge on September 24th by Terror from 27,400 yards using 2 seaplanes to spot. The weather proved to be too hazy for accurate observation, so firing was abandoned after 12 rounds. This turned out to be the last bombardment of any of the Dover monitors for 7 months, as winter and increasingly strengthened German defenses restricted operations. At the end of January 1917, Admiral Bacon, in charge of the Dover Patrol, took both Erebus and Terror to bombard the German torpedo boats, which were usually berthed inside the mole at Zeebrugge. Still, the operation did have to be called off at the last minute, owing to the immense amount of snow near Dunkirk. The early months of 1917 saw each of the 15-inch monitors take their turn as a guard ship, as there had been several German destroyer raids against ports during this time. Although there weren't any raids against Dover, there were some in the vicinity. The monitors didn't have a chance to use their 15-inch guns, but such powerful guns did have a deterrent effect. Meanwhile, preparations were being made for a bombardment against the locked gates at Zeebrugge, where Terror and Marshal Soult took on the south gate, while Erebus took on the north. The 15-inch monitors, in company with their escorts, opened fire at 4:45 a.m. on May 12th, where their first shots fell short but were soon corrected, and shooting set into a steady, rhythmic pace. The Germans put up smoke screens to hide the locks. They were wrongly placed and did not hamper the British firing. All the while, the monitors were firing. The German shore batteries were returning fire, but they were hampered by the British air cover, preventing worthwhile spotting. Fire ceased at 6 a.m., after Terror had fired some 61 rounds. The bombardment was somewhat successful, with a few rounds falling within 50 yards of the target and some temporary damage to the lock controls, as well as nearby railways and roads. Bacon wanted to follow this up with a bombardment of Ostend dockyard almost immediately. Still, like other bombardments we have discussed, it had to be called off, as conditions were not suitable. We're to take from monitors of the Royal Navy how the fleet brought the great guns to bear by Jim Crosley. On June 4th, the weather was fair and reconnaissance had reported several ships in Ostend dockyard, so Erebus and Terror set off again, leaving Soult and Moore behind. They anchored 26,000 yards offshore and opened their bombardment, using the same technique for finding direction and range as they had for the Zeebrugge attack. A spirited action took place. The German batteries replied, and the situation became difficult until a Sopwith pup of Royal Navy Air Service managed to shoot down the enemy observation balloon. Both sides were using smoke screens. The German one proved to be more effective than at Zeebrugge, eventually forcing the monitors to cease fire for fear of hitting civilians. Nevertheless, this proved to be the most successful bombardment so far. A large mine-laying U-boat, UC-70, and some other vessels were destroyed, and severe damage done to dock installations. Neither of the two floating docks had been damaged, so Bacon was anxious to take advantage of any further favorable opportunities. The next favorable time for bombardments didn't come until September, with bombardments on the 4th, 22nd, and 25th. With this continual harassment, the Germans decided to send most dockyard equipment to Bruges, and after that, Ostend was little used. We're to take from Buxton again. The three 15-inch monitors were then sent in succession to the Tyne floating dock, later AFD-4, returning in mid-October to resume patrols. But it was not to remain for long. Both Erebus and Terror were soon put out of action by German counterattacks, albeit temporarily. Terror was out of action for slightly longer. She was lying at anchor off Dunkirk at about midnight on the 18th/19th of October when heavy explosions were felt on the port side forward. 3 torpedoes from raiding German torpedo boats had struck her in quick succession, 2 right forward, the third about 80 feet abaft the stem, at the start of the full bulge protection. The boats A-59, A-60, and A-61 had approached unseen, and after discharging one 450mm 17.7-inch torpedo each, opened fire with their guns from close range. Although considerably damaged, with the forepart of the ship open to the sea, Terror was able to beach herself with tug assistance in about 15 feet of water. In the early hours of the 19th, Captain Iron, whom Bacon had appointed chief salvage officer, was roused from his bed and brought across from Dover in a tug. His survey showed that the main deck, normally at level with the sea, was flooded to a depth of several feet from the forward magazine. The hold below was heavily damaged near the bow, but owing to the close subdivision, most of the compartments further aft were watertight. Another tug was brought, and they brought Terror to Dunkirk. With the monitor beached at low tide, the damage could be seen, and taking from Buxton, the foremost 50 feet below the main deck had been largely blown away, and damage also extended to the forecastle deck. The hit further aft had been mostly cushioned by the bulge and the tubes, so damage was limited. As in Erebus's case, the bulge had proved its worth, and these two episodes reinforced in Danecourt's mind the value of including bulges in new designs where practicable. At Iron's command, her crew began building cement boxes to cover the holes, but were frustrated by the rising tide. Instead, they shored up the leaking bulkheads and pumped out some water. They were interrupted by German air attack on occasion. Still, by the 21st, Terror was back in Dover and then attempted to go on to Portsmouth for full repairs, where it proved very difficult to steer owing to the weather and the damage, forcing her to return to Dover. On the 27th, things would go much better, and she arrived in Portsmouth for full repairs. Terror's repairs took 10 weeks to complete, and she was back in Dover on January 5th, 1918. Both Erebus and Terror continued to make the occasional bombardment of Ostend Dockyard and patrols as opportunities presented themselves in the early months of 1918 after Roger Keyes had taken over from Bacon. An interesting thing to note during this time is the fact that Terror was hampered by unstable projectiles, as a faulty batch had been manufactured 5 inches too long, so rather than just scrapping the shells, they gave them to the monitors. With some minor modifications, they worked for a time, but eventually were withdrawn due to problems with loading and/or safety. Nevertheless, the big German land offensive started on March 21st, 1918, and that night, a minor diversion was made by 3 groups of German destroyers bombarding railway junctions between Dunkirk and Newport. To defend this critical area was a force of monitors and destroyers, including Terror, where she fired off star shells and began to tear into the German destroyers with her 6-inch secondaries, and the Allied destroyers soon got into the battle. A short time later, the Germans beat a hasty retreat to Ostend, followed much more slowly by Terror and her smaller escort M25. Once Keyes found out about the raid, he ordered Terror bombard the German ships now held up in the port, to which, at 26,500 yards, she dropped 39 rounds, causing considerable damage to the docks, but none of the destroyers were hit. The next several months of bombardments I have covered in my videos on Lord Clive, General Wolfe, and especially Erebus, as she and Terror tended to operate together until the end of the war, so if you want to hear more about those bombardments and or 18-inch guns, I'll leave links in the description. After the end of the war, while Erebus went to duke it out with the Bolsheviks in the Baltic, Terror had relieved Marshal Soult as director and fire control ship at Portsmouth, arriving there on January 3, 1919. In addition to these duties, she was also used as a firing ship in gunnery trials with seated German warships, her first one coming in July 1919. She fired a series of test projectiles on 100mm or 3.9 inches of armored plate from the German battleship Baden, mounted on HMS Swiftsure. They were to determine the best type of projectiles to use against moderately armored vessels, and Terror varied her ranges in these tests to determine the right striking angle. More trials took place over the next 2 years, ranging from 2-pounders to her 15-inch guns, and of course she did fire on Baden, with Erebus dealing the killing blow later on. Take from Buxton once more, as Terror was on the chopping block, but fortunately this economic measure was rescinded, so that the Royal Navy retained 3 monitors capable of operational use. In May 1922, she was again used for trial firings, this time against armor plates mounted on Superb, in connection with the design of new capital ships. Terror was formally recommissioned at Portsmouth in May 1924 as a turret drill ship in place of the battlecruiser Tiger, with a complement of 55. She remained there until 1933, when plans were made out to send her out to Singapore. A huge naval base had been under construction for several years as part of the defense of the British Far Eastern interest against possible Japanese expansion. A monitor would form a useful base and guard ship while the dockyard and fixed defenses were completed. After a long refit at Devonport, Terror left on October 9, 1933, with the gate vessel Sandgate on the 3-month voyage. Her complement of 13 officers and 202 men was not enough for both the 15-inch and 4-inch low-angle armament to be manned simultaneously, but was sufficient for her general duties. Her gunnery role envisaged anti-ship operations rather than just shore bombardment, so practice firings against surface targets were carried out. Her ammunition outfit now included only 10 rounds of HE to 100 APC per gun. In April 1937, a joint shoot by Terror and some of the new coast defense batteries were carried out against a high-speed target towed by the cruiser Barrack. Terror fired 57 rounds of 15-inch at a rate of 1.8 per minute to provide information for spotting and fall-of-shot trials. She remained based in Singapore, with only the occasional jaunt up the Malayan coast until the outbreak of World War II. Her war station was planned between the sandbanks southeast of the naval base, connected up with the fortress plot, and with a Supermarine Walrus amphibian aircraft attached for spotting duties. As Singapore's permanent shore defenses were bolstered, including 5 15-inch guns, the question of Terror's future deployment came into question in 1938. Several other overseas bases could use a 15-inch armed ship. There were plans to move her to either Trincomalee or Aden. Trincomalee was considered the best place for her, but war broke out while she was undergoing a refit in Singapore, including 6 4-inch high-angle guns and replacement of her 15-inch guns. In November 1939, she was ordered to home waters to prepare for service in the Channel once again. She left Singapore on January 29, 1940. Still, by the time she reached the Suez Canal, a more urgent need arose for her in the Mediterranean, as many ships on the outbreak of war had been withdrawn home, as it was realized Italy would not follow her German ally immediately to war. On March 11th, Terror arrived in Alexandria, which had become the main fleet base owing to the weaknesses of the defenses of Malta. In this, Terror was sent to Malta on April 4th to supplement the defenses. She was moored in the waters around Valletta and fully integrated into the fortress plot, as her main armament greatly outranged the old 9.2-inch guns of the fort. Italy declared war on Britain on June 10th, and air attacks began on Malta the very next day as 150 high-level bombers attacked in the morning and in the evening. Terror opened fire with all of her AA guns, getting off 212 rounds. From then on, air raids were a daily occurrence in which Terror put on a good show of things in her berth, not being hit and claiming damage to several aircraft. She was able to start a rearming refit on September 4th as new supplies of AA guns arrived in Malta by sea. In late October, when the Italians invaded Greece, it gave Britain the opportunity to use Ceuta Bay in Crete as an advanced fleet base. With no invasion of Malta pending, Terror would be much more useful as a guard ship there rather than in Malta. Terror was sent on to Ceuta Bay after having completed her refit. From November 13th to the 30th, she provided a useful service while shore AA defenses were improvised. She was next ordered to Alexandria in early December to prepare to give assistance to the forthcoming British offensive in Libya, thus giving her an opportunity of doing her intended role of shore bombardment after a lapse of 22 years. Taking from Crosley again, in December 1940, General Sir Richard O'Connor had launched a counterattack on Italian forces which had pushed into Egypt, and within days, the Italians were put to flight. The British force of 31,000 men, making no less than 130,000 Italians captive. Terror and the gunboats Aphis and Ladybird were involved from the start in this remarkable performance. Swordfish aircraft from Alexandria acted as spotters. The bombardment opened up with an attack by the ships on Mactilla from about 10 miles offshore. Then the retreating Italians were harried as they fled westward through the small port of Sollum. The Italians replied using their field artillery against the small bombardment squadron. Still, the range was too great for them, and Terror was able to silence the batteries while the smaller ships close inshore harried the retreating army. After 2 days and the expenditure of over 200 rounds, Terror had returned to Alexandria for ammunition and then turned her attention to Bardia, the easternmost town in Libya, right on the enemy line of retreat. For 3 days, as the unfortunate Italians were fleeing through the town, they were subjected to the fire of the gunboats and the Monitor, now joined by 2 Australian destroyers. Once again, Terror shot up the heavy enemy defensive artillery from long range, allowing the smaller ships to shell the town itself and the harbor. Enemy aircraft tried to intervene, but the ships were not hit. One of the worries during this engagement was the condition of Terror's gun barrels, which had been partially worn when they'd been fitted in Singapore. To minimize wear, 3/4 charges of cordite were used for this relatively close-range work. As soon as Sollum fell into British hands, Terror assumed the role of anti-aircraft ship, occasionally breaking off to ferry stores to Alexandria. I should mention the reason why those guns were half-worn was the fact that they had already spent 12 years as HMS Revenge's guns from 1916 to 1928. Anyway, the army was preparing to capture Bardia in early January 1941, where on the 2nd, Terror, Aphis, Ladybird, and Nat moved up to support, keeping heavy fire on enemy defenses despite air attacks. The next morning, on the 3rd, the big guns of the Mediterranean fleet made themselves felt as Warspite, Valiant, and Barham brought their 15-inch guns to bear while Illustrious provided air cover. Terror bore the brunt of the ensuing Italian air attack, during which she shot down a bomber. After the air battle, Terror provided intermittent harassment of Italian positions for the rest of the 3rd, contributing 135 rounds in those 2 days. The army then pushed up to Tobruk when Terror was called upon once again to soften up the defenses, doing so between the 20th and 21st of January. She was supported by Nat, Stuart, Vampire, and Voyager, the Australian scrap iron flotilla contributing their part to the bombardment as Terror fired off 96 rounds in this bombardment. Her guns were seriously worn now, as Buxton reports, the driving bands on the projectiles were not being properly gripped in the rifling with insufficient spin stabilization. The projectiles essentially somersaulted to their target. In 6 weeks, Terror's 2 15-inch guns had fired a total of 660 rounds, more than she had fired in World War I, as well as about 1,300 rounds of 4-inch and about 4,700 rounds of half-inch ammunition. Tobruk was the last occasion on which her big guns were fired, as after 3 weeks as air and sea defense guard ship to that port, she escorted a convoy to Benghazi, which had been captured previously. Conditions in the port were terrible, as they were well within range of the German air bases, as the Luftwaffe had arrived the previous month to assist the Italians. British air cover and air defenses were non-existent, particularly as forces were being withdrawn to help Greece. Although, interestingly enough, Terror was able to augment her AA armament with 8 captured Italian 20mm guns. She still lacked early warning radar, though. She did sustain damage from 3 near misses on the 22nd of February, which caused flooding in some bulge compartments and started leaks in the magazines, but no casualties. That same day, Cunningham ordered her to return to Tobruk, as she was in great danger remaining there. Unfortunately, she would not make it to Tobruk. Ian Buxton illustrates Terror's end better than I ever could, and taking from him one last time. On leaving Benghazi at dusk with the new corvette Salvia and the old minesweeper Farum as anti-submarine escorts, she exploded 2 acoustic mines nearby, which severely shook the ship and caused further flooding. She was caught the next day by 5 German dive bombers and 3 fighters, a few minutes after her lone Hawker Hurricane escort had departed. The bombers came in from the starboard quarter, where only the 2 aftermost 4-inch and 2 20mm would bear. These guns managed to put most of the bombers off their aim, but at about 6:25 p.m., Terror received 3 very near misses amidships, 2 to starboard and 1 to port. The already weakened hull began to buckle and split between the turret and the bridge, and a list to starboard developed. An oil fuel fire broke out in the boiler room and was only extinguished by the rising water level, which also cut off the steam to the engines, pumps, and generators. An attempt to tow by Farum failed, as Terror gradually settled by the bows. At 8 p.m., all the crew except those manning the AA armament were evacuated to Salvia, and 3 hours later, she began to settle more rapidly, with her seacocks opened and depth charges exploded to hasten her sinking. Terror finally succumbed, but without any casualties, at 4:20 a.m. on February 24, 1941, 20 miles northwest of Derna. She had given a fine demonstration of the value of monitor-type vessels in close support of military operations, a duty she was still able to perform efficiently after a quarter of a century of service. I feel as though Terror is often overlooked when compared to her sister Erebus, as Erebus had a far longer and more interesting career with many twists and turns. Terror, as Buxton put it, had given a fine demonstration of the value of the monitor-type vessels in close support of military operations, a duty she was still able to perform efficiently after a quarter of a century of service. I think that's a perfect way to end. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.